A camera aimed straight at his bedroom window was the final straw. At first, Jack tried to resolve it peacefully, but his neighbor, the smug HOA chair, simply smirked and said, "Go ahead, complain all you want." What Mark didn't know was that Jack had already started gathering evidence, and when the truth finally came to light, the fallout was more explosive than anyone could have imagined. But let's start from the beginning. Jack Wallace cherished his mornings. Every day, without fail, he would step onto his modest patio with a steaming mug of coffee in hand, letting the rising sun cast a golden glow over the neatly trimmed lawns of his suburban neighborhood. It was his moment of peace, a sacred ritual in a life that otherwise felt too hurried. The soft chirping of birds, the faint hum of distant traffic, and the comforting aroma of coffee created a cocoon of calm that Jack held dear. But that Sunday, something was different. A glint of light caught his eye, flickering sharply through the foliage that separated his yard from his neighbor, Mark's property. Jack squinted, trying to pinpoint the source of the reflection. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A sleek black security camera mounted high on Mark's fence. The device was aimed squarely at Jack's house. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, his brain scrambling to make sense of what he was seeing. It has to be a mistake, he thought, clinging to the hope that Mark had simply misjudged the angle. But as Jack's gaze lingered, the camera's positioning left no room for doubt. It wasn't aimed at the yard or the street. It was pointed directly at his bedroom window. The realization hit him like a splash of ice water. This wasn't about security. It was invasive, deliberate. A surge of anger bubbled up inside him, boiling over as he marched across his lawn toward Mark's front door. The crunch of gravel beneath his feet echoed the pounding of his heart. When Mark finally opened the door, his expression was infuriatingly calm. He leaned casually against the doorframe, a smug smile playing on his lips, as if he'd been expecting Jack. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his tone dripping with false politeness. Jack didn't waste time on niceties. "Why is your camera pointed at my window?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. Mark's smirk didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. "Just keeping an eye out for the neighborhood," he said with a shrug. "Nothing personal." Jack's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. "It's personal when it invades my privacy," he shot back. "Take it down." But Mark only shrugged again, as if Jack's words carried no weight. "It's within my property rights," he said smoothly. "You're welcome to call the cops if you think otherwise." The casual dismissal was like a slap in the face. Jack stared at Mark, his chest tight with frustration, before finally turning on his heel and walking away. There was no point arguing with someone so unapologetically smug. Back in his home, Jack paced the kitchen, his coffee now cold and forgotten on the counter. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the curtains felt like an invasion. Mark's camera wasn't just a breach of privacy, it was a violation of the sanctuary Jack had worked so hard to create. Sitting down at the table, Jack buried his face in his hands, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Mark's dismissive attitude gnawed at him, making it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding or a harmless oversight. This was deliberate, calculated. And as much as Jack wanted to go back to his peaceful routine, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't something he could let slide. The days that followed were anything but calm. Jack Wallace, once able to find peace in the sanctuary of his home, now felt like a prisoner under constant surveillance. He thought the single camera pointed at his bedroom was bad enough, but when another appeared, this time aimed at his backyard, Jack's frustration boiled over. Every time he stepped outside, whether it was to water the garden or simply let the fresh air clear his head, he could feel the invisible presence of Mark's cameras tracking him. The once quiet hum of the neighborhood had turned into an oppressive silence, broken only by the imagined whir of lenses adjusting to his movements. Jack decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. He called the local police, explaining the situation in careful detail, but their response was cold and procedural. "That sounds like a civil matter, sir," the officer said over the phone. "You'll need to address it with your neighbor or consult a lawyer." Jack hung up, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of it all. How is this not illegal, he thought, pacing the length of his kitchen. He wasn't going to let this slide. Determined to fight back, Jack started documenting everything. He took photos of the cameras, meticulously noting their angles and positions. He even set up his own small surveillance system, pointing cameras at Mark's property, not to invade his neighbor's privacy, but to capture proof of Mark's intrusive behavior. If Mark wanted to play this game, Jack was going to beat him at it. As Jack delved deeper, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Conversations with his neighbors revealed that he wasn't the only target. A retired couple 2 doors down admitted they'd stopped using their backyard altogether after Mark installed a camera overlooking their patio. Another neighbor, a young mother, mentioned that Mark had once offered to keep an eye on her kids while they played in the yard, a suggestion that left her uneasy. "It's all under the guise of community safety," one neighbor said bitterly, "but it feels more like control." The stories painted a chilling picture of a man who had taken it upon himself to monitor the entire neighborhood, whether they liked it or not. Jack's frustration was now mixed with resolve. This wasn't just about his privacy anymore. It was about standing up to someone who had overstepped every imaginable boundary. Jack consulted a lawyer who confirmed what he had already suspected. Mark's actions violated state privacy laws. The lawyer explained that while homeowners had the right to install security cameras on their property, they were not allowed to aim them at areas where others had a reasonable expectation of privacy, such as backyards and bedroom windows. Armed with this knowledge, Jack decided it was time for another confrontation. He marched back to Mark's door, this time with legal statutes in hand. Mark opened the door with the same smug expression as before, leaning casually against the frame as if he hadn't a care in the world. "Your cameras are illegal," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. He held up the printed laws, pointing to the specific clauses that proved his case. Mark glanced at the papers, then back at Jack, his smirk growing wider. "Good luck proving it in court," he said dismissively, crossing his arms. Jack didn't flinch. If Mark thought this would scare him off, he was sorely mistaken. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a fight Jack intended to win, no matter how long it took. As Jack walked away, the weight of the neighborhood stories and his own determination settled on his shoulders. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing it for everyone who had been made to feel small under Mark's watchful eye. This wasn't just about cameras. It was about reclaiming the freedom and peace they all deserved. The air in the small community center was thick with tension. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, but the people sitting in them were anything but orderly. Murmurs of frustration rippled through the room as neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. At the front of the room stood Mark, confidently addressing the group with his usual smug demeanor. "These cameras are for your protection," Mark said, his voice steady and authoritative. "We've had break-ins before, and this is about keeping everyone safe. Frankly, I'm surprised anyone has an issue with that." Jack Wallace stood near the back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He could feel his blood boil as Mark continued to twist the narrative. The gall of it, turning a blatant invasion of privacy into some noble act of service. Jack wasn't about to let Mark manipulate the room. Jack took a step forward, clearing his throat. The murmurs quieted as all eyes turned toward him. "Let's talk about facts, not spin," Jack began, his voice firm but calm. He reached into a folder and pulled out printed stills from his own cameras. Holding them up for everyone to see, he said, "This is footage from my property. It shows Mark adjusting his cameras to invade private spaces, not public areas. This isn't about safety. It's about control." A ripple of gasps spread through the room as Jack passed the images around. People leaned forward in their chairs, their faces a mix of shock and anger. Jack continued, his voice gaining momentum. "I've also spoken with several of you, and your stories match mine. These cameras aren't protecting anyone. They're making us all feel like prisoners in our own homes." He gestured toward an elderly couple in the front row. "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, would you like to share what you told me?" Mrs. Taylor, her voice shaky but resolute, said, "We stopped using our backyard because of his cameras. It's uncomfortable knowing someone might be watching. We shouldn't have to feel like that in our own home." Her words hit like a thunderclap. The room erupted into murmurs again, this time louder, more unified. And then came the bombshell. Another neighbor, a young man named Kevin, stood up. "I found out something even worse," he said, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "Mark's been sharing footage from these cameras with other members of the HOA without anyone's consent. It's all on a shared server, and anyone with access can see it." The uproar was immediate. Voices overlapped as people demanded answers. Mark's confident facade began to crack, his smug smile replaced by a defensive scowl. He raised his hands, trying to quiet the crowd. "This is all being blown out of proportion," he said, his voice tight. "Jack here is just stirring up unnecessary drama." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Jack's calm yet decisive demeanor had swayed the room, and Mark's attempts to deflect only made him look more guilty. Jack took another step forward, his eyes locking onto Mark's. "This isn't drama. This is about our right to privacy. And if you think you can bully this neighborhood into silence, you're wrong." The room erupted into applause, neighbors rallying behind Jack. For the first time, Mark looked genuinely uneasy. The meeting ended with the group agreeing to file a formal complaint against Mark and the HOA. Jack's lawyer, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, assured the group that they had more than enough evidence to build a strong case. As the neighbors dispersed, Jack stood near the door, shaking hands with those who stopped to thank him. What had started as a personal fight had turned into a collective stand. Mark's reign of surveillance was crumbling, and Jack felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just about one camera or one neighbor. It was about reclaiming their lives and their peace of mind. The community was united now, and together, they were ready to take the next step. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt like the battle was no longer his alone. The courtroom was filled to capacity, the air heavy with a mix of tension and curiosity. Neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder, their whispers a soft hum as they speculated about the outcome. Jack Wallace took his seat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer calm and composed beside him. Across the aisle, Mark sat with a thick stack of HOA documents, his posture stiff but his expression smug, at least for now. Mark's lawyer began the proceedings, painting him as a diligent community leader. "My client acted in good faith," they claimed, gesturing to the HOA charter. "The cameras were installed to protect the neighborhood from potential threats. Any concerns about their placement have been exaggerated." Mark leaned back in his chair, the faint smirk on his face, hinting at his belief that this would all blow over. But that confidence began to waver as Jack's lawyer took the floor. "Let's focus on the facts," she began, her tone measured but firm. She presented the first piece of evidence, footage from Jack's own cameras. The courtroom projector came to life, displaying clear images of Mark, adjusting his cameras to focus on private areas, bedroom windows, backyards, and patios. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as the undeniable evidence unfolded before their eyes. The lawyer didn't stop there. She called on several neighbors to testify, each one recounting their experiences. An elderly couple described how they stopped using their backyard, feeling constantly watched. A young mother explained how her family avoided their patio out of discomfort. Even a neighbor who had initially defended Mark admitted that the surveillance had gone too far. The testimonies were powerful, but the final blow came when Jack's lawyer presented a detailed report. "Your Honor," she said, holding up the evidence, "we have discovered that Mr. Mark stored all footage on an unsecured server. This means that anyone with basic technical knowledge could access private recordings of residents without their consent." The judge's expression hardened as he reviewed the report. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Mark's lawyer fumbled for a rebuttal, but it was clear they had nothing to counter the mounting evidence. "This is a clear violation of privacy laws and a gross abuse of your position within the HOA," the judge declared, his voice steady and authoritative. "Your actions are not only illegal, but deeply unethical. You have shown a blatant disregard for the rights of your neighbors." Mark's face drained of color as the judge delivered the ruling. He was ordered to remove all surveillance equipment immediately and prohibited from installing any future devices without explicit consent from the affected homeowners. He was also fined heavily and required to pay substantial damages to Jack for emotional distress. The HOA itself faced serious consequences. The judge mandated a full review of its policies and operations, insisting on greater transparency and accountability. The ruling wasn't just a victory for Jack, it was a turning point for the entire community. As the gavel struck, a murmur of relief swept through the room. Some neighbors clapped softly, while others nodded in quiet approval. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered around Jack, shaking his hand and thanking him for standing up to Mark. What had started as one man's fight had become a collective stand against an abuse of power. Mark left quietly, his once confident demeanor shattered. For Jack, they said, the victory was about more than winning a case. It was about restoring dignity and peace to the neighborhood. As he walked away from the courthouse, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Justice had been served, and his community was stronger for it. Mark's fall from grace was swift and absolute. Once the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, he now found himself stripped of his position in the HOA. The cameras were removed within days of the court ruling, their absence finally allowing residents to breathe freely. For the first time in months, patios and backyards were alive again. Children playing, families gathering, and a shared sense of relief rippling through the community. But Mark's presence was now a shadow of its former self. Where he once walked with his head held high, he now avoided eye contact with his neighbors. His former allies in the HOA distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. At community events, the space around him seemed to grow wider, as though his arrogance had left a tangible mark that no one wanted to touch. Jack Wallace, however, was not the type to gloat. He didn't need to. The victory spoke for itself, and the neighborhood's restored peace was reward enough. But Jack wasn't content to stop at simply winning his case. He saw an opportunity to turn this personal fight into a broader cause. The damages awarded to him by the court could have gone toward home improvements or a well-deserved vacation. But Jack had a different plan. He donated the entire sum to a local privacy rights organization, ensuring that others who face similar invasions of their personal space would have the resources to fight back. But Jack's efforts didn't stop there. Fueled by his experience, he began working with lawmakers to draft stricter regulations around the use of surveillance equipment in residential areas. He attended city council meetings, spoke with legal experts, and even helped organize a petition to raise awareness about the issue. What had started as one man's stand against a neighbor had grown into a movement for change. The neighborhood, inspired by Jack's resilience, rallied together like never before. They dismantled the remnants of the old HOA leadership and established a new, transparent board that prioritized mutual respect and fairness. Instead of invasive surveillance, they launched a proper community watch program based on collaboration and consent. Residents volunteered to keep an eye on the area during agreed shifts, creating a safer environment without sacrificing privacy. As for Mark, he became a ghost in the neighborhood he once sought to control. Every time he crossed paths with Jack, his eyes would dart to the ground, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Jack never said a word to him. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Even the most entitled individuals aren't above accountability. For Jack, the victory was about more than reclaiming his privacy. It was proof that standing up for what's right can ripple far beyond a single conflict. He had shown his neighbors and himself that resilience and determination could dismantle even the most entrenched abuse of power. In the weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood began to feel normal again. Jack would sit on his patio in the mornings, the quiet hum of the neighborhood returning to what it once was. This time, however, there was a deeper sense of peace. His fight hadn't just restored his own sanctuary, it had brought the community closer together. Jack's story became a reminder to everyone who heard it. No matter how daunting the challenge, standing up for your rights is always worth it. And in the end, justice doesn't just fix what's broken, it builds something stronger.